just got set up. Can we open our Bibles, please, at Daniel chapter 2? You know, we've been excited, haven't we, with what we've just been thinking about in terms of bringing us up to date in regards to world events and Bible prophecy. And really, prophecy does and should excite us, brothers and sisters, because, as our president said, it is most probable that we are the last generation before the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth. And if you look at how people of old were invigorated by their understanding of Bible prophecy, we need to start looking at ourselves as well and considering how we are indeed excited by these events. Just take an example here in Daniel chapter 2 of the prophet Daniel. And look at verse 19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He removeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. And that, brothers and sisters, is a man who has had things revealed to him. That is the prophet Daniel. And we also can share in the things that were revealed to Daniel, of course, in this chapter of Daniel chapter 2. But consider then, just by reading the example there of the Spirit word of Daniel, the fact that Bible prophecy allows us to see God's wisdom and mighty power. It shows us, does it not, that God is in control. It informs us as to God's timetable. Where are we in regards to God's purpose? It gives us knowledge which we can't find anywhere else. We're in the age of the internet. But most of the stuff on the internet will not inform us as to God's timetable. And it gives us more than anything, brothers and sisters, confidence. No matter what stresses, no matter what trials that we have to face in these last days, in this dark and degenerate generation, we can have confidence in our understanding of the truth, as we've seen with Brother Jonathan this day. So here we are then in Daniel chapter 2. We're all very, very familiar but we know with Daniel chapter 2. Thank you, Brother Jonathan. Not only does he speak, he's a technician as well. So we know Daniel chapter 2, the image of a Nebuchadnezzar that he saw in the dream, how it was metallic, how it had 4 different metals running through it. It has the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, and the legs of iron. And we know what those things signify. We should be doing these in our Sunday schools and in our Bible lectures. And just on that point, I would just like to say, and join with Brother Jonathan, we need to have more lectures on Bible prophecy. Daniel 2 is a fantastic chapter to show to our interested friends, because it really does prove various things, amongst which, obviously, the infallibility of our scriptures. But more than that, it proves that the kingdom of God is on the earth. And it proves that the Lord Jesus Christ is going to return to the earth. There's a few points, though. There's a few points I want to make clear, though. You know, when we kind of consider why Daniel chapter 2 was given, it gives us the framework of most, if not all, of latter-day Bible prophecy. If you have a quick look at the reasons why it was given in verse 28, there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. So what was going to happen was this dream would ultimately show King Nebuchadnezzar what was going to happen in a particular time period called the latter days. And this was to be all about what would happen hereafter to his empire, to the kingdom of men. And so we know we've got these various metals, the various different empires that would succeed each other, that would sit upon the kingdom of Babylon's territory and would absorb its influence down through time. But notice this detail here in verse 35, when the stone, the Lord Jesus Christ, hits the image. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. So although we've got this kind of continual historic timeline, as it were, in the image with all the various metals, ultimately what Daniel sees is the end picture. What's going to happen in the latter days? And what does he see happening in the latter days? Well, he sees a completed image that, although it has all these historical elements, somehow they're all together and they're unified and they're against the Lord Jesus Christ, who comes and smites them. And so when we compile all of the territories of the kingdoms of men onto one map there, we get this idea that all these territories are going to be unified together somehow. And I think this is an important point, because when we come now in a few moments to look at the King of the North and the great controversy of the end, we have to bear in mind our framework. And the framework here is very, very clear in Daniel 2 that all these areas are going to be combined together. Keep that in mind. And we've already pointed out the fact that in verse 28, this vision was going to be given to Nebuchadnezzar to show him what was going to happen in this time period called the latter days. Now, brothers and sisters and young people, if you haven't already, a very good Bible study to do is to look up that phrase, the latter days, and to piece together the pieces that you'll find in the Old Testament prophecies all about the latter days. And you'll find some very interesting things. One of which is you'll find this in Hosea chapter 3 and verse 5. Afterwards shall the children of Israel return in the latter days. Because this time period of the latter days, when you go through that study, suddenly you realise that this is a time period which really has to do with the events in the world that we see around us today. We know that we're in the feet phase. We've seen the demise of the Roman Empire. And now we're giving another detail that in Hosea chapter 3 it talks about the Jews being dispersed for a period of time, but then returning together in the latter days. We are in the latter days, brothers and sisters, and we have seen, have we not, the re-establishment of the nation of Israel back in their land. We've seen over 60 years of that. And so it is indeed exciting for us to consider the events of Daniel chapter 2, the stone returning to smite that image, is about to happen. So just bear that detail in mind, the latter days, and flick on now to Daniel chapter 10. Now, we looked at Daniel chapter 10 with Brother Jonathan, and I was quite thankful in a way that he didn't go to the verse I wanted to point out, because it would have spoilt it, really. So I'm pleased he didn't. But we know the context. We've looked at it. Daniel here, what a man. You know, what a man. He is there. He is crying. He is mourning. He is refusing to eat because he wishes to increase his understanding of Bible prophecy. And as we see, the angel comes to him. And this is what we missed out just earlier on. Look at verse 14, what the angel says to Daniel. He says, "Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days." And you see, brothers and sisters, we have a connection here, don't we? Daniel chapter 2 gives us the framework, and now we're going to get some more detail in what's going to happen in this time period of the latter days in the following words of the angel. And we know those words contain the events of Daniel chapter 11. The final picture, though, is going to show us what's going to happen in the latter days. And this is what we get in verse 40. 3 characters. "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him." And as we've seen, there are 3 characters here. How do we make this out? Well, again, we'll just have a little recap of what Brother Jonathan's spoken to us about. But basically, you can see there, hopefully, when Alexander died, he had 4 generals that took over. He didn't have any children. So there are these 4 territories. Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus were the generals that took them over. And the narrative picks up 2 of these generals and the territory which the narrative picks up 2 of these in relation to Israel. One that's called the King of the North, here the Seleucus territory, and here towards the bottom is the Ptolemaic territory over Egypt that we've already looked at. Now, a couple of key points. As we go through this chapter, as Brother Jonathan's pointed out, we have these wars between these two kings, the king of the north and the king of the south, and they're warring. But these kings, these nations, are always occupying nations upon these territories. And we've seen that even when we get to verse 40 and the things that we've looked at with the king of the south pushing up. That was an occupying force. The British force was occupying the territory of Egypt. And here we have the occupying forces, the Greeks, which occupied these territories. They were not native. And so this chapter is all about these kings, and it's well worth marking up the king of the south maybe in green and the king of the north in red, so we can see as we go through the chapter how these things come to pass. But one thing happens. There's the king of the south and there's the king of the north. But something happens around verse 30. You see, we stop reading about the king of the north and the king of the south from verse 30. All we read about is this king. Verse 36, sorry. The king. And I want you to note something. I'm just going to point something out, because careful Bible reading helps us to appreciate what we've already learned with Brother John, that there are in fact 3 characters in verse 40. Now look at this. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself, verse 37. Neither shall he, at the end, for he, verse 38, but in his estate shall he honour, his fathers shall he honour, verse 39. Thus shall he do, whom he shall acknowledge, that's verse 39. And so then when we come on to verse 40, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him. It's very, very clear that the he and the him and the himself here all relates to this king that appears on the prophecy in verse 36. Now, how this outworks historically is that, in fact, the territory of the king of the north and the territory of the king of the south became dominated by one single power, the Roman power, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern side of the Roman Empire. And its capital was in Constantinople, Istanbul. That is the area of the king. That's where he resides, the dominion of the king. And we know, as time's gone on, that that side of things was taken over, as we read in our first class, by the Ottoman Empire, as prophesied in Revelation chapter 9. So there we have it. There's the king, and there we have the territory of the king of the north and the territory of the king of the south. And what we're being told is that at the time of the end, there is going to be a revival, an occupying power over the territory of the king of the north that's going to come against the king. And if we put the modern map of the nations up there, you'll see that there's part of Turkey's got to go into that. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, right up to the Indus River in India. We're expecting a power, an occupying power, to come and to dominate that territory. That's what we're expecting in the time of the end. But remember, that's just the big picture. There is other stuff going to happen. Daniel 11 is just focusing in on that eastern side of the kingdom of men. But let's have look at a couple of other key points here. It's going to be fast, this invasion by the king of the north. It says there in verse 40 that he's going to come like a whirlwind. And the word for whirlwind, it really does mean like a tornado. To shudder, to quiver, to sweep away in a storm. This is going to be a fast and a ferocious attack. This king of the north territory coming against the king. And he's going to come with chariots and horsemen and many ships. This is a military force to be reckoned with. Vehicles of war and of sea are going to be used in this invasion, firstly of the king. And then, after we read of the king being attacked and overtaken, we read at the end of verse 40 that he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land. So this trigger that starts with the king of the north power invading the area of Turkey, the area of Constantinople, is just the start because he overflows from there and he comes down into Israel and into Egypt. And that story is going to be told hopefully by Brother John shortly. But we're focusing in on this initial invasion of the king by a power which is going to arise over the territory of the king of the north. So this is our expectations then. Just by reading Daniel 11 very, very carefully, we expect the rise of an occupying power to dominate the territories of the king of the north. And we expect that this power will invade the remnants of the power of the king, which has been pushed at by the British, which resides in Constantinople, Turkey, using naval and army military units. That's what we expect by just having a careful consideration of Daniel chapter 11. Now we could ask ourselves the question, well, is this the only prophecy that talks about these events? And of course that is not the case. There are lots of prophecies, and as we pointed out in the Old Testament prophets that talk about the latter days. But I want to take you to one that is very, very important, particularly for young people. It's essential for you to get to grips with this prophecy, and it's Ezekiel chapter 38. Those of us who've studied prophecy for some time will be very, very familiar with Ezekiel 38. Why? Because in Ezekiel 38 it tells us who this invading army really is all about. Who are they? Where have they come from? Who's their leader? Ezekiel 38 talks about this invasion. In verses 1 through to 7, we read of the actual nations involved. They're headed up, in verse 2, by a character called Gog. And in verse 8 onwards, we read of how this great invasion of Israel takes place. And bear in mind that you've got to piece this together with Daniel 11. Because Daniel 11 talks about invading Turkey first and then coming back down into Israel. But here we jump straight to the invasion of Israel. I just want to show you that this is indeed connected with Daniel chapter 11. You know, there's so many things that kind of slot together that really I think it can be in no doubt whatsoever that these are the same events being recorded. Consider this. Look at Ezekiel 38 and verse 8. And after many days, thou shalt be visited in the latter years. Verse 16, midway through, it shall be in the latter days, and I will bring thee against my land. So the time period is the same. The latter days. This is going to happen in the latter days, just as Daniel chapter 11 is going to happen at the time of the end in the latter days. The origin of this invading force is from the same place. Look at verse 15 of Ezekiel 38. And thou shalt come from thy place, this is the invader, out of the north parts. Daniel 11, we've got the king of the north. And here in Ezekiel 38, we have the north mentioned. This is where the invader comes from. We didn't look at it in detail in Daniel 11, but if you check it out in verse 33, you find that there's a confederacy in Daniel 11. There's other people with this invader, Libya and Ethiopia. And they're mentioned as well as allies of Gog in Ezekiel 38. It's got the same movements when you study it. It has the same transport as the horses. It's got the same target of the attack. In Daniel 11, it talks eventually of the invader coming into the glorious land, at the glorious holy mountain. And here in Ezekiel 38, we read of its invasion on the mountains of Israel. It's got the same motivation of attack, this invader. The same attacking style. In verse 9, it talks about it coming like a storm in Ezekiel 38. In Daniel 11, we already saw how this king of the north invader is like a whirlwind. And ultimately, the invader meets the same end. And what's wonderful in Ezekiel chapter 38 is at the very end we read of why this has all happened. That God will have been magnified. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. This is the great manifestation of God on the world stage, and the power and the glory of God will be visible at that time. So this is the same thing then. This is the same story. And as we've said, we get some details. In verse 2 we read, "Son of man, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog." And so we read of this place called Magog. Now, brothers and sisters and young people, it's I think sometimes we brush over these things and we go, "Oh, of course we know where Magog is. We know where these places are." But I would say, brothers and sisters, we need to mark these things up. It is important we understand where these territories are from the ancient histories of old. I personally find history pretty dry, but when it's connected with Bible prophecy, it is exciting. It helps us to appreciate, really, the latter-day events that we are to expect on the earth. So where's this Magog, then, that Gog comes from? Well, Josephus, writing about 94 AD, that's about 600 years after Ezekiel was written, so it's about like us talking about what's happened in Henry VIII's time, but he was obviously a student of these things, unlike us, who I could barely tell you the names of his wives, but there we are. And Josephus records this very important thing, because he says that Magog was founded, those that from him were named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. So what Josephus is saying is if you can find what the Greeks called Scythians, if you can find the land of the Scythians in Greek writings, you'll find Magog, the land of Magog. And I've done my very best to go to the Greek writings and find out for us. And this was Herodotus, known as the father of history. He wrote his histories book around 450 BC, a couple of hundred years out from Ezekiel. And he records that there's 8 key rivers that flow through the land of Scythia. And it's quite tricky because they don't all have modern names like we'd expect if we open an atlas. You can't find them very easily. But the main ones that we can find, I've plotted up there on that map. And so that gives us the idea of the land of Magog being in this vicinity, in the heartland of Europe and north into the very heart of Russia. This was the land of Scythia. So Gog comes from this territory. And every now and again, what I was going to do in this section is just wheel in an expert. Here's our expert. This is Jusenius, a very famous Greek and Hebrew scholar in the 1800s. And he also concludes a similar thing. He says that Magog is a region and a great and powerful people of the same name, inhabiting the extreme recesses of the north, who are at some time to invade the Holy Land. We are to understand just the same nations as the Greeks comprised under the name of Scythians. So that's our expert opinion. It's not just Brother Matt's conclusion. There are educated people as well who have concluded similar things. Now there's another thing that we need to point out here in chapter 38 and verse 2. I'm sure we're all familiar with this, but it's worth pointing out for our young people that where it says there, "Set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech, Tubal, and prophesy against him," that actually there's another nation, another name mentioned in there, hidden away. It should be the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. The word Rosh there is translated chief. It should be head or Rosh. It's a name. And this is a tricky one, I've got to admit. The reason is because traditionally we connect, of course, Rosh with Russia. And by the way, before everybody jumps up and runs out, I am completely behind that. But I think we have to face the fact, brothers and sisters, that it is tricky because Rosh or Rus these people only really come to the fore in historical terms around 900 AD, the 9th century. It's almost 1,000 years after Ezekiel writes. And I think there's an explanation for this because, of course, I think these people come from the uttermost parts of the north. This is where they belong. And so if they hadn't come down into the areas of history, like where Herodotus was residing, the Greeks wouldn't really have come in touch with them. But to be fair, brothers and sisters, I think the Greeks had come into touch with them. It might not be recorded in modern history, but what's interesting to consider is that the Septuagint renders this word as a name of Rus. The Septuagint reportedly written, at least the bulk of it, around 200 BC. So the Greeks did know of a people called the Rus around 200 BC. We don't have it in any of their other writings, but we have it through the translation they give in the Septuagint. The Greeks were aware of them. And as I say, you've got to fast forward till the people of the Rus really come to the fore. This is in France, in the Abbey of St. Bertin. And one of their French emperors comes across some of the Rus. This is a Arabic scholar, Ahmed Baglan. He travelled around the Arabic world trying to spread Islam, and we have his writings. And he says that he saw the Rus in the Volga, just by the river Volga. The Primary Chronicle is an ancient Russian historical document, also known as the Manuscript of Bygone Years, which I think is quite nice, and that records what happened, particularly when the Rus were around. Look at this. In the year 6360, that's their calculation, the 15th of the induction at the accession of the Emperor Michael, the land of Rus was first named. We have determined this date from the fact that in the reign of this emperor, Rus attacked Zagreb, which is Constantinople, and you can see that's what they look like if you're interested. That's the Rus attacking Constantinople back in the 11th century. To conclude all that history around the Rus, what we're saying is that there is the land of Rus. They really struck up. Their capital, in fact, was Kiev. They're known in history as the Kievian Rus, and their name does correspond with the Rosh, the Rus, here in Ezekiel chapter 38. Now you might say, Brother Matt, it's very handy us sitting here in the year 2013 making all these connections between Rosh here in Ezekiel 38 and these people called Rus on just this linguistic sounding name being similar. But brothers and sisters, I think this is a fantastic piece of evidence. This here is from a chap called Leo the Deacon. He was a Bible student around the time that these people of the Rus came to the fore. They existed before, but this was the only when they came to the fore and they started uniting all the tribes of Russia. And this is what he wrote when he was living in that day. He said, "They, the Rus, came out on the plain and searched for their dead. That this people is reckless and warlike and mighty and attacks all the neighbouring peoples is attested by many people, among them the holy Ezekiel, who alludes to them when he says as follows, 'Behold, I will bring upon you Gog and Magog, the ruler of the Rossi.'" So what that's saying, brothers and sisters, is that this isn't our connection necessary as Christadelphians. When these people rose up and became prominent in the world, there were Bible students who said, hang on, these are the people that Ezekiel spoke about a few hundred years ago. And so this is the connection that was being made by people at the time, not by just us all these years later. And just wheel out our expert again. Here's Gesenius. Rosh, proper name of a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshach, undoubtedly the Russians, he says. What about Meshach and Tubal? Well, we'll just go through these ones quickly. We know they were both trading powers at the time of Ezekiel because he mentions them as trading with Tyre in Ezekiel chapter 27. Meshach is mentioned in the Assyrian records as Muski. Herodotus mentions them as the Moshki and Tibereni, and Strabo, who is a Greek kind of historian, geographer, he mentions where they lived. He said that they lived at the foot of the Caucasian or Moskian mountains. So the Caucasian mountains were also known as the Moskian mountains. They're in Caucasian Iberia, and Josephus also records that that's the case, that Tubal gave rise to Thobles, who are now called the Iberes. So we get this idea of modern-day Georgia being these territories upon which Ezekiel is prophesying about. Now, you'll be pleased, there's the expert again, he also agrees that they dwelt by the Black Sea. So thank you, Gesenius, you can go now. So the thing is we've got to now think about how this fits in with our understanding of Bible prophecy. We haven't got time to go through all the other confederate nations who are also mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 38 between verses 1 through to 7. But if we did, you'd find exactly the same. You could do the same thing. You can follow it back in ancient history and find where these nations actually came from and actually resided at the time of Ezekiel. And it gives us a general idea of this territory here. This whole sweeping territory right here from Spain all the way through to the start of India. And what's absolutely fascinating, and of course it's this territory, as we've seen, that comes from the north and attacks, headed up by Russia. But what's fascinating, brothers and sisters, is when we compare that territory told of us in Ezekiel chapter 38, which is going to be united against God's people in the latter days, and we compare that with Daniel chapter 2, we find the territory is virtually the same. The only detail in terms of territory we get extra from Ezekiel 38 is that Russia is more heavily involved. And so we get this amazing picture. Does it fit with the framework of Daniel 2, having Ezekiel 38 in here? Yes, it does. And then when we piece together what we've found out from Daniel chapter 11, we see that Daniel 11 is focusing in on this very small bit, the leader, the leadership, the king of the north. It also fits with this framework. A power will emerge over the king of the north territory, but it will unify the other territories around it and come against Israel. This is the big picture. This is the big controversy of the latter days. And the stone will come and destroy that power, that image, stood up on east and west. There are many other prophecies, as we've said. If you're a young person, if you've not looked into them, check out Revelation 16, Joel 3, Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14 and read those through, and you'll see that they're all talking about this great controversy at the time of the end. So let's just take a breather and consider what we've just thought about. Now we've compared Ezekiel 38 as well with Daniel 11. We're looking at, for an occupying power, the king of the north, who's going to appear over the territory of the Seleucid Empire. And we've seen that because this is the leader of this is Russian, that it's going to be Russian from Ezekiel 38. But it's also going to be confederate with European and North African nations. It's going to attack Turkey by land and sea, and after that its forces are going to spill over from Turkey and come down into Israel and Egypt. So that's our biblical analysis of these things, just by comparing and reading very carefully our Bibles. Now what's absolutely fascinating, brothers and sisters, is that we can look up from just thinking about these things from a biblical perspective. We can look up and look at the world today, and we can see some amazing events taking place around these territories. So here is Turkey. What do we know about Turkey? Well, Turkey, after the Ottoman Empire fell, it becomes a republic. And one of the interesting things is it turns very much to be very Western focused. It sets up Western universities. It views Islamist Ottoman Empire history as being kind of a stagnant and weak thing. So you find that they don't teach the Ottoman Empire in school properly between this period. It's kind of dubbed down. It was their great empire which has been taken from under them. And so what they do is they start to look towards the West. They try to join the EU. They make peace with Western allies, such as Israel. And so we find them really being quite pro-West. They invite America in as well. There's a lot of American bases in Turkey. But from 2005 onwards, I really believe we're beginning to see a shift in Turkey. Their application to the EU is stalled. It's still they think it's going to revive shortly, but it's not really got much hope because Turkey doesn't accept Cyprus as a nation, and we're going to come on to that shortly. You remember that Turkey's fallen out with Israel, compromising its position there with the flotilla escapade that took place a few years back. And so it's at odds with Israel. And we've seen it appealing to its old Muslim brothers in the Middle East again. And it's starting to definitely get more Islamic. It lifts a ban on its head, on the Islamic headscarf, the government did. It promotes Islamic education now much more than it used to, and it's restricted the selling of alcohol in Turkey. It's turning to become more Islamic, as the BBC there has reported in January 2011. So what we're saying is that we've seen a shift from being pro-Western to becoming much more pro-Eastern, antagonising the Western-focused countries. And this is a bit of a tear in Turkey. There's a big tear between those that liked to be liked to be Western and view this Islamic side of things as being quite scary. And so we're seeing a lot of protests taking place in Turkey. But that's not all their problems, because of course we have the crisis in Syria. And really the crisis in Syria is really crippling Turkey, because Turkey has supported the rebels in Syria from the very beginning of the civil war. It doesn't like Assad. And so the refugees have been fleeing from Syria into Turkey. And military actions have been taking place between Turkey and Syria. They are in effect at war. Syria is shooting down Turkish warplanes. Turkey is shooting down Syrian warplanes. As soon as they go into their airspace, they're blown up. Turkey's sending all its troops to the border of Syria, because it's really concerned about the way that the Assad regime is conducting itself. You notice that this is sucking in Russia. Look at that from the 12th of October 2012. Syria plane carried radar parts, not weapons, says Russia, because Russia's been sending stuff across to Syria. Syria pulled down the plane, and Russia's up in arms. And look what it says, the report. Russia has remained an ally of the Syrian government, whereas Turkey has been a critic of Syrian President Assad since anti-government protests erupted there more than a year ago. And Assad is threatening Turkey, and they're shooting down various military helicopters and so on. And the crisis of refugees is becoming worse and worse in the area. It really is a terrible conflict. And what's interesting is how the nations of the world have been all sucked in to be thinking about these things. President Assad has said that the Middle East is a powder keg that's ready to explode. You know, if this is his assessment, brothers and sisters, can we not see how the angels are at work, ready to bring around events that we expect from Bible prophecy? Syria civil war expects 4 million more Syrians to flee next year. It's terrible, terrible things, brothers and sisters, but it is bringing in all the nations that we expect to see from Bible prophecy. One of the things that it has done as well, brothers and sisters, is really show America's decline in influence in the Middle East. Russia is the new big boy. Russia is the new school bully. Russia is the one now calling the shots. And this was brought to the fore when, you know what happened? The Assad regime was alleged to have used chemical weapons, which it probably very much well did, because it's now admitted that it's got them. And America said, right, let's bomb them. And there were lots of negotiations, and who should come to the fore? Why? Vladimir Putin of Russia, the Syrian ally, who strikes a deal with the Syrians and says to them, well, look, if you give over your chemical weapons, then maybe America won't bomb you. And so they promoted this idea, and it really was a great success for Putin. It made Obama look very, very weak, and it made Putin look very, very strong, like it's sticking up for its allies. And so, really, Putin outsmarted Obama. And we're seeing more and more in our news stories, America is declining in its international respect. Edward Snowden has just worked for the American Secret Service. Obviously, he's fled to Russia, and Russia is now looking after him, and he's letting go all these secrets, one of which is that America are tapping the phones of all the European leaders like Angela Merkel. And this is causing absolute outrage. But brothers and sisters, can we not see how all these things are damaging America's prominence, but lifting up Russia's prominence in the Middle East? And what's happening with Russia? Well, this man, Putin, since he took over, he's investing in military. What did we see in Daniel chapter 11? They're going to attack with horses and chariots and many ships. So we expect a powerful territory, a powerful nation of Russia, the Rosh, to be investing in their military in the latter days. We read in articles like this: Russia's military is back. One of the distinguishing characteristics of Vladimir Putin's presidency has been his commitment to revitalizing Russia's military. Russia is now engaged in its largest military build-up since the collapse of the Soviet Union more than 2 decades ago, with major increases in defence spending budgeted each year to 2020. Russia's military is back. You know, when we see things like this, brothers and sisters, when we consider in our community there was a bit of a waning as to whether or not Russia was indeed the power horse of the great attack of Ezekiel 38, these things should help convince us that indeed our pioneer brethren were correct. These things are taking place, and we should be electrified as we consider these things. Look at this one. The military holds the largest manoeuvres since Soviet era. And do you know who oversaw all those manoeuvres personally? President Vladimir Putin. There he is there looking out over the battlefield. The Defense Ministry said the drill is the largest in the country's post-Soviet history. Indeed, Russia is back. And look at this one. Not only is it building up its military and exercising its new power, it's also joining with its allies and also holding military drills. Russian-led security bloc. Do we not see the leader of Ezekiel 38? Who's the leader? Gog of the land of Magog from Russia. And here he is. Russian-led security bloc. A Russian-led military alliance. The drills, dubbed Unbreakable Brotherhood in 2013, involve over 2,500 servicemen and more than 500 units of military hardware from Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia and Tajikistan. So we've got there, brethren and sisters, the amazing events that are taking place. And not just on land. We see the Russian Navy are going to receive 24 subs, 54 warships by 2020. The ships are coming of Russia. As a result of the implementation of the state rearmament program to 2020, the Navy should receive 8 nuclear-powered strategic submarines and so on. So the ships are being built ready to attack the king of Daniel 11. And more interesting than that, brothers and sisters, is that Russia plans to keep some of those new ships right next to Israel, right outside Turkey's front door in the Mediterranean Sea. The deployment of Russian warships in the Mediterranean had been a subject of planning for some time. Russia has indeed been planning this move. But what I want you to notice, brothers and sisters, is that this intent to keep these warships in the Mediterranean has also exposed some of Russia's really good allies. And how do we know that? Because they've made agreements that their ships, as they're going through into the Mediterranean, can stop off and have a cup of tea, or I suppose if you're Russian, a shot of vodka, and rejig your, make sure they get all their supplies, and then move on into the Mediterranean. And these ports are Cyprus, Montenegro, Greece, and Syria. They're all key allies of Russia, and they're all supply points for their Mediterranean fleet that they want to keep in the Mediterranean permanently. Now, if we get a map up on the screen and we just pop those ports on there, you'll see how interesting this is becoming. Because we have up the top the northern ports in the Black Sea, but we can see now Russia's tentacles spreading south. We've got them in Greece, we've got them in Cyprus, and of course their ports in Syria, in Tartus. So it's looking very, very interesting in regard to what we know about Bible prophecy, because they're now in the Black Sea permanently, and Russia is now in the Mediterranean Sea permanently. And they're seeking their partners. They've already got that port agreement, but Greece here was commentated about maybe being Moscow's new naval power. And so we see them sending down their ships, particularly after the events of Syria, because Syria is so fragile. They've got their port there in Tartus. They're getting a bit worried, so they're sending even more of its ships down south. Things are hotting up in the Mediterranean. Its largest naval deployment since Soviet times, this article says. And where is it deployed? Near Turkey. And why is it there? Why is it in the Mediterranean? This article says that Russia's sent those ships as a deterrent against military actions by Turkey. So you've got Russia on one side and Turkey on another side. This is exactly what we expect. And again, it says the biggest deployment of Russian ships worldwide in the post Soviet era. You know, when Putin took over, I don't even think the Russian navy was floating at the time, and now we see it in its power. And why is it there, really? Well, one thing that's fascinating, if you follow Brother Don's milestones and the updates that he gives at the Rugby Prophecy Day, you'll know very much about the fact that Israel have found great gas underneath its shore, underneath the sea, just off its coast. But what's fascinating is that another nation, Cyprus, has also found tons and tons more gas. Tons and tons more gas. In fact, they call it the Aphrodite gas fields, south of Cyprus, found by American company Noble Energy. And apparently, one of these sections, I think it's section 12, it contains from 142 billion to 227 billion cubic meters of gas. And according to the Cypriot Minister of Commerce, the Block 12, which is just there, that one there alone would meet Cyprus's domestic needs for the next 3 centuries. That's how much gas they found in that area. And so, who should be poodling along to try and get their hands on some of this gas? Well, our friends, the Russians. And what's even more fascinating is the conflict that this is causing, because there's a problem, you see. Because the north of Cyprus is owned and is owned really by Turkey. And they're at odds with the Cypriots in the south, the people of Cyprus, the Greek sort of Cypriots. And so there's this conflict going on between the two. You see, the Turkish people don't recognise the southern people, and so the Turkish people believe all this is theirs. But the Cypriots, obviously, the Greek Cypriots, don't accept that. And so there's a major problem going on. And Russia's supporting, at the moment, the Greek Cypriots. It wants to get its hands on some of this gas. And so what we're finding is it's trying to do deals, Russia, with Cyprus. It's trying to get some bases, some solid bases. It can pull into their ports, but it wants to get its own base there, particularly because in Syria, Tartus is getting a little bit near the edge in terms of war. And so it wants these bases in Cyprus. And this is causing a lot of trouble. And it's already helped to bail out Cyprus from its financial problems a few times. And so we're looking and watching these events, because eventually, if it does get a base there, it's going to really upset Turkey, particularly if it helps drill and helps get gas out of the sea into Europe, bypassing Turkey, which is the plan that's been rumoured in the media that's on the agenda. So we've got to keep an eye out on these things, particularly with Cyprus being almost bankrupt. It needs help. And so it may indeed eventually give a base there to Russia, which will be very interesting for us. But this is what it's doing. It's causing the Russians to really get involved and embroiled in the conflict between the south and the north of Cyprus, between the Greek and the Turkish areas. And really, because Cyprus is like a tax haven for a lot of the Russian people, you get a lot of Russians in Cyprus. And this is what this article's saying. Cyprus has become a small Russia in the Mediterranean, they call it. Cypriot-Russian relations have only grown stronger. And really, this is fascinating from a Bible prophecy perspective. Gas fields off Cyprus stokes tensions with Turkey. And again, we get this problem, because Turkey says it will not tolerate exploration, and Cyprus says it will proceed. And so we get this conflict happening. And look at this. This was only this week. Turkish military claims interception of Russian spy plane. The Russians are spying on the Turkish. They want to know what's going on, because the Russians are desperate for that gas. And so we can see here things really heating up, as we would expect, just leading up to the events prior to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. What about Iran? We've not got much time, but we know that Iran and Russia are allies. Here they're holding talks on defence. One of the generals of Iran has said, that was just this week as well, has said that they believe that the more the two countries' defence doctrines are aligned, the more the regional stability will be promoted. Russia, again, allies itself with Iran, and it's working against the West to remove the sanctions in Iran. Now, why have I gone into all that? Well, really, in terms of a summary, what you can see then is that the nations surrounding Turkey at the moment, they're all behind them is Russia. Behind Russia, in Greece, in Syria, in Cyprus, in Iran, is our good friend, the Russians. And they are preparing themselves, brothers and sisters. They are preparing their ships. They are preparing their military. Are we preparing ourselves? Because sure enough, Daniel 11 will take place. Turkey will be invaded by an occupying power over the King of the North territory, and it will be removed. And it will then flow down into Israel. These events are soon to take place. I wonder if we can turn back to Daniel chapter 12. You see, there's another event that's mentioned that takes place within the latter days, within the time of the end. And it's the event, really, brothers and sisters, that we are all waiting for here today. You see, it says there in Daniel chapter 12, still following on from Daniel 11, and at that time, what time? The time of the end, the latter days. At that time shall Michael, one like God, stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble since there was a nation. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. Even to that time, that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And this is what we're waiting for, brothers and sisters. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Many are called, brothers and sisters, but few are chosen. There are two classes, aren't there, that are going to be raised. Those that awake to everlasting life, and those to shame and everlasting contempt. That is an exhortation to us, brothers and sisters, to consider the fact that Bible prophecy is happening around us. We don't know whether the gas in the south of Syria is going to be the catalyst to bring around the invasion of Turkey and so on, as we've looked at. But we sure enough can see the signs that the angels are indeed at work. The pieces of the puzzle are being slowly put into place, and it could well be that those things are the great catalyst of events that we are expecting. And brothers and sisters, we have to bear in mind that we want to be those that awake to everlasting life. And so we make the answer now in our lives. Did you notice the two things, the two characteristics? They that be wise. We've got to be wise, brothers and sisters. And not only that, it's those that turn many to righteousness. And so as we await the return of our Lord Jesus Christ to this earth, let's do our best to open up our ecclesial halls, to invite people in to hear Bible lectures that do indeed invite them to come and turn themselves to righteousness. Because soon enough, the time will be at an end, and our Lord Jesus Christ will have returned to the earth. Just consider this, brothers and sisters. We've seen Russia at work in the Middle East, unifying its allies. This is what Brother Thomas said in the preface to Elpis Israel. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand.